There is something almost perverse about the story of Zungaru. Britain chose it as the capital of an entire protectorate, poured money and labor into building it up, and then walked away from it barely 15 years later. Not because of a war, not because of a revolution, but because the place was simply too uncomfortable for the people running it. That tension between imperial ambition and colonial reality is what makes Zungaru the perfect place to start this story. Cast your mind back to 1902. Frederick Lugard, one of the most consequential and controversial administrators in British imperial history, needed a headquarters for the Northern Nigeria Protectorate. This was a vast territory stretching across the West African interior, and Britain had only just formally declared control over it. Lugard had previously worked out of Lokoja and Jeba, both of them functional enough in their own way, but neither felt quite right for what he had in mind. He needed somewhere that could serve as a genuine command center, a place from which British authority could project outward across the whole of northern Nigeria. Zungaru looked good on the map. It sat close to the navigable stretch of the Kaduna River, which meant river transport could bring in supplies and personnel. A steam tramway connected the town to the water. The location seemed central enough that British forces and officials could reach the northern territories they were trying to bring under administrative control. It was, in Lugard's calculus, a pivot point, a place where geographic access and military reach overlap. So Zungaru became the capital. What followed was a substantial act of colonial construction. Government offices went up, European residences were built, hospitals, military facilities, clerks' quarters, roads, waterworks, and dams all followed. A colonial report from 1904 to 1905 records the continued investment, staff housing, medical infrastructure, public works, the physical skeleton of a bureaucratic machine designed to function permanently. Britain was not dabbling here. This was meant to last. And then the officials actually had to live there. The heat at Zungaru was punishing in a way that administrative reports tend to understate. The terrain was rocky, which made it genuinely difficult to establish the kinds of shaded, tree-lined avenues that colonial planners like to impose on their tropical capitals. Gardens barely survived. Roads were hard to maintain over the rough ground. But the heat and the rocks were almost secondary concerns compared to the disease. Malaria was not an abstraction in Zungaru. It was a recurring, grinding reality that officials and soldiers experienced personally. The mosquitoes were relentless. The isolation made medical attention slow and unreliable. Accounts from people who served in the region described the same rhythms: illness, recovery, illness again. Zungaru asked a great deal of the people stationed there, and what it asked hardest was their health. Here's the thing worth pausing on. The climate and the disease were not neutral background conditions. They were part of the administrative calculation from the very beginning, and when they proved too costly, they became the central justification for finding somewhere else. Colonial governance was always this, a negotiation between what power wanted to control and what the controlling class was willing to endure in order to hold it. The answer to Zungaru's problems was found roughly 100 kilometers to the north. Kaduna had qualities that Zungaru lacked. It sat at the crossing of the Kaduna River and the Lagos to Kano Railway, which mattered enormously, because river transport alone, especially around the Niger and the rocky sections near Zungaru, was unreliable. Low water seasons could effectively cut a capital off from its supply lines. A railway connection changed that equation completely. Kaduna also offered better prospects for water supply and more hospitable ground for the kind of planned, orderly colonial town that British administrators wanted to see around them. It was more centrally positioned for administering the whole of the Northern Protectorate. On every practical and imperial metric, it was a better choice. The transfer did not happen overnight, and the exact date depends on what you're measuring. Kaduna was designated the preferred replacement site around 1913. The West African Frontier Force moved there first, ahead of the civil administration. The government's full administrative transfer is generally dated to 1917, though some accounts say 1916, reflecting the difference between when decisions were made and preparatory relocations began versus when the civil machinery of governance actually completed the move. The safest way to say it is that the capital shifted during the 1916 to 1917 period, with the military leading and the bureaucracy following. By either date, Zungaru was finished as the center of power. What happened to Zungaru afterward is almost poignant. A town that had absorbed years of construction investment, that had appeared in official colonial reports as a capital in progress, simply stopped mattering. It did not vanish from the map, but it receded from history, too small to sustain itself as a commercial center, too remote once the railway connection ran elsewhere, too forgotten once the administrators who had suffered through its heat had moved on and stopped writing about it. A capital city, purpose-built and then discarded because the people who built it found it too hard to live in. This is where the larger question starts to come into focus, and it is a question worth keeping in your head for the rest of this story. Every colonial capital in this video was chosen by someone for a reason. Someone decided the site, someone decided what the capital would control and how it would project authority over the surrounding territory. And someone always paid a cost that was not borne by the people doing the choosing. In Zungaru's case, that cost was paid partly by the African communities whose land, labor, and autonomy were organized around a European administrative experiment, and partly by the lower-ranking soldiers and clerks who actually had to live in the heat and the malaria while the architects of empire made their decisions from further away. Zungaru was not unique in being abandoned. It was unique in how quickly and completely it was forgotten, even as the administrative logic that created it kept replicating itself across the continent and beyond. The same questions: where does a colonial power plant its flag? What does it build around that flag? And how does it use the surrounding landscape and its people to sustain control, were being asked and answered simultaneously across the river systems and coastlines of Africa and Asia. The answers, as you will see, could take very different forms. Some capitals were fortified river mouths, built to funnel out rubber and ivory. Some were mountain retreats, built so that administrators could govern without having to look too closely at the populations they governed. Some were conquered cities, stripped of their kings and queens and turned into instruments of someone else's rule. And some, like Zungaru, were simply chosen, used up, and left behind. The next places on this map were anything but forgotten. If Zungaru represents a capital discarded when it stopped being convenient, the next chapter on this map is something considerably darker. These are the capitals that worked exactly as intended, places where the machinery of colonial rule functioned efficiently, extracting enormous wealth at an enormous human cost, and where the administration behind the violence was not some distant abstraction, but a set of deliberate decisions made inside actual offices and actual buildings by actual people who knew what was happening in the territories they controlled. Start at the mouth of the Congo River. Boma became the administrative capital of the Congo Free State on the 1st of May, 1886, a date that sounds like the founding of something legitimate, and in bureaucratic terms, it was the location made strategic sense in the coldly logical way that colonial geography usually does. Sitting at the river's mouth, Boma connected ocean-going shipping to the interior river routes, allowing customs operations, military supply, and the export of ivory and rubber to move through a single controlled point. Everything that came out of the Congo's vast interior had to pass through or be accounted for at Boma. It was not incidental that this was the capital. It was the capital because it was the choke point. What passed through that choke point, and at what cost, is where Boma's history becomes something that needs to be examined carefully, rather than swept into a general horror story. The Congo Free State operated through a concession system in which villages and territories were assigned rubber quotas. Fulfill the quota or face the consequences. The Force Publique, the colony's armed enforcement arm, implemented that system on the ground, and what Roger Casement documented when he investigated in the early 1900s was not an abstract policy but something viscerally, specifically brutal. Casement served as British consul at Boma, which means he was embedded in the administrative machinery of the very system he was exposing. His 1904 report records, interviews, testimonies, and observations. Hostage-taking used as leverage to ensure rubber delivery, beatings, killings, and the severing of hands, collected as proof that bullets issued to Force Publique soldiers had actually been used. These were not rumors, they were documented cases with named locations and described incidents. Morel's contribution was different, but equally important. Working from shipping records, Morel noticed something that the commercial ledgers themselves revealed. The Congo was exporting vast quantities of rubber and ivory while importing almost nothing that would suggest a genuine trading economy. What came back were weapons and ammunition. That discrepancy told a story no apologist for Leopold's regime could fully explain away. The combination of Casement's ground-level reporting and Morel's statistical argument created an evidentiary record that forced the issue into British and international politics. What the evidence does not support and what responsible narration should not assert is a single precise death toll for the Congo Free State period. Numbers in the millions have been cited, and population losses during this era were real and catastrophic. But the specific figures vary dramatically depending on the time period, the geography included, the methodology, and the sources used. The documented record supports mass atrocity. It does not support one settled number, and treating those estimates as established fact would misrepresent what historians have actually been able to verify. What can be said without question is that the administrative decisions coordinated from BOMA, the quotas, the enforcement structure, the authorization of coercive methods, created the conditions for widespread killing and mutilation across an enormous territory. The capital organized the violence even when it did not commit it directly. BOMA eventually lost its status as capital in 1926 when Leopoldville, today's Kinshasa, took over. The shift was connected to Henry Morton Stanley's earlier expeditions, which had established Stanley Pool as a key interior node. Moving the capital upriver reorganized colonial administration around the Congo's interior network rather than its ocean outlet, a practical reflection of how Belgian rule, after Belgium absorbed the Congo Free State in 1908, was trying to consolidate territorial control over a genuinely vast interior. The relocation was not a reform of the system. It was a rationalization of it, adjusting the geography of extraction to make administration more efficient. The pattern of the fortified capital, commercial security hardening into territorial power, appears in an even starker form when you shift from Central Africa to South Asia. Fort William on the Hooghly River started its life in the 1690s as the East India Company's Bengal headquarters. The logic was commercial. At least initially, the company needed to protect its warehouses, its shipping lanes, and its personnel in a territory where it was operating as a trading entity, not a government. A fort provided that protection, but a fort also provides troops, administrative offices, and a defensible base from which operations can expand, and in the company's hands, that is exactly what happened. The distinction between a trading post and a governing power blurred steadily over decades, with Fort William at the center of the process. The moment that hardened the company's political grip on Bengal came in June 1756, when the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Daulah, captured Calcutta and took the fort. Then came the episode that became one of the most famous and most contested stories in British imperial history, the Black Hole of Calcutta. John Zephaniah Holwell, who survived the incident and later wrote about it, claimed that 146 British prisoners were crammed into a small room inside Fort William on the night of June 20th, 1756, and that by morning 123 of them had died from heat, suffocation, and thirst. That account became enormously influential in shaping British attitudes toward Siraj-ud-Daulah and toward the company's subsequent actions. But the story as Holwell told it has been seriously questioned by later historians, not because something terrible may not have happened that night, but because the specific numbers, the prisoner list, and certain details of the account do not hold up under scrutiny. Questions about the room's actual capacity and the reliability of Holwell's precise statistics have made the 146 and 123 figures contested rather than established. The honest position is that the black hole was a real incident that became a politically potent narrative, and that the narrative's political usefulness to the company likely shaped how it was told and retold. It became a justification for retaliation, and that retaliation came quickly. The British retook Calcutta in January 1757, and Plassey followed later that year, cementing the company's political dominance over Bengal in ways that would reshape the entire subcontinent. The question to keep asking, as always, is who selected the site and what did it actually control? Fort William was chosen as a commercial base, but what it ultimately controlled was the political and economic life of an entire region. And the transition from one to the other happened through a combination of deliberate company decisions, military action, and the exploitation of episodes like the Black Hole to justify expansion that was already underway. Batavia offers yet another variation on this theme, and in some ways the most architecturally honest version of it. Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, the Governor General of the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, destroyed the existing settlement of Jayakarta in 1619 and built Batavia in its place. The design was explicit about what it was: a walled, fortified city that combined the functions of warehouse, office, barracks, and prison in a single controlled perimeter. The walls of Batavia were not incidental, they were the argument. The VOC used this city to regulate shipping, labor, taxation, and trade across an enormous range of Asian commerce, with the Governor General and the Council of the Indies administering the monopoly system from inside those walls. Surveillance and regulation were not features of Batavia's governance, they were its purpose. For well over a century, Batavia functioned as the VOC's command center for Asian trade. Then in 1740, the accumulated tensions of the city's Chinese community involving migration, sugar production, labor regulation, and fears of rebellion, both real and manufactured, exploded into one of the most violent episodes in the VOC's history. VOC authorities and Batavia's other residents carried out a massacre of the Chinese population inside and around the city walls. Scholarly sources describe thousands killed, but casualty estimates vary considerably depending on the source and how the boundaries of the event are defined. Assigning a precise number would misrepresent the historical record. What can be said clearly is that this was not a chaotic breakdown of order. It was a massacre carried out in a city whose entire design was built around controlling population, managing labor, and protecting Dutch commercial interests. The violence happened in the heart of a system that had always used coercion as a governing instrument. What connects Boma, Fort William, and Batavia across 3 different continents, 3 different colonial powers, 3 different centuries is something simpler than a shared ideology. All 3 were capitals of distance and control. All 3 converted commercial or military presence into something that looked like governance, and then used that governance to extract wealth from surrounding territories and populations. All 3 answered the recurring question of who pays the cost in the same basic way. Not the people who selected the site, not the administrators who ran the offices, but the people who were governed from those places and had no voice in how they were governed. The cities that follow this pattern of fortified coercive command are stark, but they are not the only model colonial power used to organize itself. Sometimes the strategy ran in the opposite direction, not walls and river mouths and choke points, but altitude and distance, the deliberate separation of the governing class from the people it ruled. The next stops on this map took that logic to its most comfortable and revealing extreme. So if the fortified capital was one solution to the problem of governing people who hadn't asked to be governed, the hill station was another, and in some ways a more revealing one, because it made the logic of separation visible in the landscape itself. You didn't need walls if you had altitude. You didn't need a perimeter if the mountains kept the wrong people out as effectively as any garrison. Simla sits in the Himalayan foothills at roughly 7,000 feet, and that elevation was always the point. British officials had been retreating there seasonally since the early 19th century, drawn by temperatures that felt nothing like the killing heat of Calcutta in summer. But in 1864, the arrangement became official. Viceroy Sir John Lawrence moved his executive council and roughly 500 staff up from the plains, and Simla became the recognized summer seat of imperial government. For about 6 months every year, the government of British India, one of the most complex colonial administrations in the world, covering hundreds of millions of people across an entire subcontinent, was run from a Himalayan hill station. By the 1880s, the departments that had relocated included foreign affairs, finance, public works, telegraphs, railways, and the army. These were not minor functions. These were the decisions that shaped Indian life at every level. And they were being made somewhere that the vast majority of Indians could not reach, could not afford to reach, and were in many cases not permitted to reach on equal terms, even if they could. The official justification was health and climate. Hot weather in Calcutta was genuinely dangerous, and that part of the claim was not fabricated. But climate was doing a lot of work in the colonial vocabulary of this period, and it is worth being specific about what else it was doing in Simla. The European zone of the city centered on the mall, the ridge, the clubs, and the official residences, spaces that were socially and in practice racially bounded. Indian residents were concentrated in the lower bazaar and the peripheral neighborhoods below. Property ownership followed a similar logic of exclusion. Indian princes, for example, were discouraged from purchasing prominent houses in the European sections of town, and documented records show that Indian-held properties in those areas fell from roughly 1/7 of the European appropriate housing stock in 1886 to just 7 properties by 1907. That is not a natural market outcome. That is a system. The layout of Simla was not accidental. European homes, government offices, and elite leisure spaces sat above or apart from Indian commercial and residential districts in both the social and literal sense, above them on the hillside separated by the physical geography that colonial planners and social convention had conspired to turn into a boundary. What the seasonal migration created was something that contemporaries occasionally called a Little England, a space where British officials could govern a country of hundreds of millions while minimizing the everyday contact with that country that might otherwise have been unavoidable. The decisions came down from the mountain. The consequences were felt on the plains. This was not a cheap arrangement either. A parliamentary answer from 1895 put the gross annual cost of moving the imperial government to Simla at around £60,000, a significant expenditure that the Indian government bore, meaning that Indian tax revenue was funding the comfort of the officials who taxed it. Who selected the site? British administrators motivated by their own comfort and a genuine belief in the health benefits of altitude. What did it control? The entire administrative apparatus of British India for half of every year. Who paid the cost? The population that had no representative in that government, no seat in those clubs, and in many cases, no legal access to the spaces where the decisions were made. Dalit in French Indochina followed a similar structure, though it arrived through a somewhat different path and carried even more explicit ambitions. The French colonial search for a cooler environment in Southeast Asia led the physician Alexander Yersin to identify the Lang Biang Plateau in 1893, a high plateau in what is now southern Vietnam, sitting at an elevation that produced temperatures dramatically lower than the coastal lowlands. Governor General Paul Doomer promoted the site's development aggressively in the late 1890s, and a colonial council formally selected the plateau as the preferred location in 1906. What followed was not simply a resort taking shape organically, but a planned urban development. Roads, then rail connections, medical facilities, schools, farms, hotels, and government buildings, all constructed in a deliberate sequence with an administrative function in mind from the beginning. The centerpiece of that ambition was the Lang Biang Palace Hotel, completed in 1922, which anchored a European administrative and leisure district in the city's center. French urban planning divided Dalat into clearly delineated zones: government, military, European residential, and indigenous areas, with the same logic of spatial hierarchy that Simla had encoded into its hillside geography. Dalit was a sanatorium and a military outpost and an administrative center and an elite playground simultaneously, and those functions were not in tension with each other. They were the point. The leisure was part of the governance. The comfort maintained the governing class in a physical and psychological condition to continue ruling. The ambitions for Dalat scaled up further as the colonial period wore on. Around 1937, French officials began seriously proposing Dalat as the federal capital of the entire Indo-Chinese Federation, a project that produced formal planning work and culminated in the Dalat Conferences of 1946. The post-war reality, resistance movements, the impossibility of restoring pre-war colonial arrangements, the collapse of the Federation project made the capital proposal obsolete before it could be realized. But the proposal itself is revealing precisely because it was considered at all. French planners looked at a highland retreat built on the labor of Vietnamese workers, governed by racially coded planning rules and serving the comfort of a European administrative class, and they saw a potential capital. That tells you something about what they understood a capital to be. What Semla and Dalit shared beyond the altitude and the temperatures and the architecture borrowed from European models was a dependence on a very specific kind of inequality. The land those cities occupied was taken or purchased on colonial terms. The labor that built them, the roads, the hotels, the government buildings, the bungalows, was local labor, often poorly compensated and sometimes coerced. The housing and the club memberships and the legal access to certain streets and spaces were distributed along racial and status lines that had nothing to do with neutral planning and everything to do with who was governing whom. Climate and health were real concerns wrapped around the governing logic that would have required separation even in a temperate climate, because the separation was never really about temperature. It was about maintaining the social distance that made the whole enterprise feel from the inside like something other than what it was. Both cities were comfortable precisely because the people who paid for that comfort did not get to share in it. And once you understand that, you start to see that the hill station and the fortified river capital are not opposites. They are two faces of the same system, one ruling through walls, the other ruling through altitude, both asking the same population to bear the cost. That cost was not always borne quietly in the colonies that follow on this map. The response to taxation, conquest, and displacement took forms that the colonial record tried hard to minimize, and in some cases almost succeeded in erasing entirely. Freetown is one of the oldest questions in the whole story of Atlantic slavery and what came after it. The settlement was founded in 1792 as a British-backed home for black loyalists, formerly enslaved people who had fought on the British side in the American Revolutionary War and had been evacuated first to Nova Scotia before the climate and the hostility made that untenable. They were joined later by Jamaican Maroons and increasingly by Africans liberated directly from slave ships that Royal Navy patrols had intercepted along the West African coast. The deep natural harbor and the sheltered peninsula made Freetown a logical naval base, and that geography gradually transformed a settlement conceived around liberation into something else, a command center, an administrative hub, the machinery of a territorial empire being assembled piece by piece along the Upper Guinea coast. So from the beginning, Freetown carried two identities that were never entirely compatible. It was a place of refuge and a place of rule simultaneously, and as British territorial ambitions expanded into the interior, the second identity started to overwhelm the first. The Protectorate of Sierra Leone was declared in 1896, extending British authority over interior territories in a single administrative stroke. That expansion required revenue to run itself. It required money to pay officials, to fund the frontier police, to maintain chiefly salaries and administrative infrastructure. Governor Frederick Cardew's solution was the hut tax. The logic was straightforward from the colonial perspective. Every dwelling in the protectorate would be taxed annually, and that revenue would flow through Freetown to cover the costs of the colonial project that Freetown was directing. What Cardew was really saying was that the people whose territory had just been absorbed into the protectorate would now pay for the machinery of their own administration. Who selected the site? What did it control? Who paid the cost? Freetown controlled everything, and the people in the interior paid the price. The response was not quiet. Bai Bure, the Temne ruler of Kase in the northern part of the protectorate, refused payment and refused arrest when colonial authorities came for him in early 1898. What followed was not a spontaneous uprising, but a sustained military campaign organized by a leader with a clear tactical intelligence. Bai Bure's forces used stockades and trenches, blocked roads and controlled river access, and used their knowledge of the landscape to make movement extremely costly for British and frontier police columns trying to pin them down. The disruption of communications between Freetown and Port Loko was deliberate and effective. This was not a crowd with machetes. This was organized guerrilla resistance by someone who understood that colonial forces depended on the ability to move quickly and communicate reliably, and who systematically attacked both The colonial response matched the colonial pattern. British forces moved to cut off food supplies and systematically targeted the settlements that supported Baibure's network. By late May 1898, British military reports were recording the destruction of 97 towns and villages in his operational area. 97, that figure comes from the colonial record itself, from reports filed by the people doing the destroying, which means it is almost certainly a floor rather than a ceiling. Baibure held out until November 1898, when he was finally captured. He was deported to the Gold Coast, present-day Ghana, removed from the territory and the people he had defended in the manner that colonial administrations had found most effective for neutralizing leaders who had demonstrated they could not be broken through force alone. The documented history of Baibure supports a portrait of a skilled and strategically thoughtful commander who led a serious military resistance against attacks imposed without consent on a territory absorbed without consent. The folklore that accumulated around him in later decades, some of the stories of supernatural protection, of precise engagements with figures that may be legendary additions, deserves some caution. His historical significance does not depend on those embellishments. The guerrilla campaign is real. The 97 destroyed settlements are real. The deportation is real. That record alone makes him one of the most significant figures of armed anti-colonial resistance in West African history, and it requires no mythology to do so. From Freetown to Rangoon is a considerable distance in geography, but a very short distance in colonial logic. Rangoon had been the administrative center of British Burma since 1862, when the annexation of Lower Burma made it the natural capital of a colonial territory that was being commercially and politically organized around the Irrawaddy River and its delta. By 1885, Rangoon was a functioning colonial city, a port, a commercial hub, a bureaucratic center, and it was preparing to extend its administrative reach northward into the last independent kingdom. The Third Anglo-Burmese War, if that is even the right word for what happened, lasted less than 2 weeks of significant fighting. British forces moved up the Irrawaddy River toward Mandalay through November 1885. They occupied the royal capital on November 28th. King Tibaw surrendered the following day. And then, in a moment that crystallized the entire logic of conquest by administration, Tibaw and Queen Supailat were escorted from the palace and placed in a bullock cart. That image is worth dwelling on for a moment. The king and queen of Burma removed from their capital in a cart as a crowd of onlookers gathered to watch. They were taken down the Irrawaddy to Rangoon, placed on a ship, and sent to India. They eventually settled at Ratnagiri on the western coast, where Tibaw died in 1916. Supailat survived until 1925, eventually permitted to return to Burma, but never to rule or to resume any public role. Mandalay, the sacred capital of the Burmese kingdom, became a British administrative post. Rangoon, which had already been doing the practical work of colonial rule for 2 decades, became the uncontested capital of a country whose king was living in a colonial bungalow 1,000 miles away. What Rangoon controlled after 1885 was everything: customs, revenue, law, land tenure, labor, the rice trade that defined Burma's economy, and the administrative appointments that determined who held local authority. The Burmese monarchy had organized society around a set of relationships between king, court, monasteries, and village. Rangoon replaced that entire structure with a colonial civil service that answered to London. The cost of that replacement was borne by a population that had not been consulted and could not easily contest it, because the only institution with the authority and resources to contest it had just been loaded onto a ship. And then there's Antananarivo, which may be the least familiar of these 3 cities, but which illustrates the same logic with particular clarity, partly because the resistance lasted longer, and partly because the end of the Merina monarchy was documented in enough detail to make the erasure very visible. Antananarivo sits on a ridge in the central highlands of Madagascar, and it had been the capital of the Merina kingdom for generations before French military interest in the island became impossible to deflect. Queen Ranavalona III came to the throne in 1883, and for more than a decade she and her government, with Prime Minister Rainalaya playing a central role in directing foreign policy, attempted to navigate a position that was becoming untenable. French military and diplomatic pressure had been building steadily, and a protectorate treaty imposed after the 185 Franco-Malagasy War had already constrained Merina sovereignty considerably, though the Malagasy government contested its terms. French forces captured Antananarivo in 1895. The Queen remained nominally in place under the protectorate arrangement, but that nominal status lasted less than 2 years. General Joseph Gallieni arrived as the new colonial governor and moved quickly to consolidate French authority, suppressing an armed resistance movement that had emerged after the French takeover. In February 1897, with the precise sequencing across the 27th and 28th, somewhat compressed in various accounts, Ranavalona III was removed from power and the Merina monarchy was formally abolished. She was exiled first to Réunion and later transferred to Algeria, where she spent the remaining decades of her life before dying in 1917. The question of how much direct personal agency Ranavalona III exercised in resisting the French versus how much the political and diplomatic maneuvering was conducted by malaria-ridden and court officials around her is genuinely contested in the historical literature, and it would be dishonest to flatten that debate into a simple narrative of a queen single-handedly defying an empire. What is clear is that Antananarivo was the center of a functioning and sophisticated monarchy that French forces chose to eliminate rather than merely subordinate, and that the woman who had been queen was removed from that city, from that kingdom, and from any political life, because her continued presence made the claim to have abolished the old order harder to maintain. The pattern across Freetown, Rangoon, and Antananarivo is the same one that has appeared in every capital on this map, just expressed through different instruments. Taxation without consent, followed by military force when taxation was refused. Conquest organized through a riverine city that had already been functioning as a colonial command center. A monarchy abolished and its ruler exiled so that the governing machinery could operate without a symbolic alternative to itself. In each case, a capital city was the place where the decision was made and from which the consequences radiated outward. And in each case, the people who paid the cost in money, in burned settlements, in deportation and exile, were the people who had never been asked whether the capital should be there at all. The pattern of capitals built to extract and control did not always begin with a crown decision. Sometimes it began with a charter. Mombasa is the clearest example of what happened when Britain decided that empire could be run, at least for a while, as a business proposition. In 1888, the Imperial British East Africa Company received a royal charter under Sir William Mackinnon, a Scottish shipping magnate who had made his fortune moving goods and people across the Indian Ocean. The company's concession covered the coastal strip leased from the Sultan of Zanzibar and extended claims deep into the interior toward Uganda. And from the moment it received that charter, the company did not simply trade. It governed. The powers written into that arrangement were governmental in every meaningful sense. The company negotiated treaties with local rulers, and surviving treaty language from 1892 describes those rulers as placing their territories under the company's rule and government, which is not the vocabulary of commerce. It collected customs and taxes, it issued licenses, it administered justice, it policed its territory, it raised infrastructure. Britain had handed a private company the instruments of a state and told it to make the whole thing pay for itself, which was always a more complicated proposition than it sounded. Mombasa was the logical headquarters for all of this. The island city sat at the intersection of the Indian Ocean and the interior routes that led toward Uganda, making it the point through which everything moving in or out of East Africa had to pass. The company established itself there in 1888, and immediately the harbor, the commercial networks, and the existing urban infrastructure became the platform for territorial expansion. Fort Jesus made the strategic calculation visible. The Portuguese had built the fort between 1593 and 1596 to control Mombasa's port, and it had changed hands repeatedly over the centuries. Portuguese, Arab, Swahili, and eventually English authorities had all understood that whoever held that position overlooking the harbor could regulate what moved through it. supplies, people, customs revenue, access to the interior. The fort itself was not a company construction, and that matters. The IBAC inherited a military and commercial geography that had already been contested and consolidated over 3 centuries. What the company did was plug itself into that existing logic and extend it inland. Commercial infrastructure and administrative infrastructure became the same infrastructure. The company promoted road building toward the interior and the Uganda Railway, which the Crown eventually took over and completed, between 1896 and 1901, linked Mombasa to Lake Victoria. These were not neutral engineering projects. Moving a railway across that distance meant moving officials, troops, tax collectors, and information. It meant converting a coastal trading headquarters into the gateway of a territorial state. A company headquarters became, through those routes, a colonial capital. The experiment collapsed for a reason that keeps appearing in the chartered company story. The costs of actually governing territory, of maintaining armed enforcement and administrative presence across a landscape that was not simply agreeable to being governed, exceeded what commerce could return to shareholders. In May 1894, the company's shareholders voted to surrender the charter. On July 1, 1895, formal authority passed from the company to the British Crown at Mombasa. The machinery the company had assembled, the headquarters, the routes, the treaties, the administrative habits, transferred intact to the state that had always been waiting behind it. This is what Mombasa demonstrates in the cleanest possible form, that a private company could prototype imperial rule, absorb the early costs and political risks of establishing control, and then hand the working apparatus to a government that stepped into a going concern. The capital was already built. The question of who selected the site had one answer. The question of who paid the cost had another. The same dynamic of a company-built capital eventually being discarded when imperial geography shifted sits at the center of the next city on this map, one named after an explorer, developed as a foothold and ultimately abandoned when the railways and the administrators decided they needed to be somewhere else. Livingstone followed the same logic. A company needed a base, selected a site, built the machinery of governance, and then watched the machinery become inconvenient when the geography of power shifted. The city carries the name of David Livingstone, the Scottish explorer and missionary who reached the Zambezi Falls in 1855 and became, in the imperial imagination, the defining symbol of what Britain told itself it was doing in Africa: spreading civilization, fighting the slave trade, opening a continent to light. That version of the story was always more useful as propaganda than as history, but the name stuck and the settlement grew around it. When the railway reached the Zambezi between 1904 and 1905, and the Victoria Falls Bridge opened, Livingstone became the obvious southern gateway into the territory. The British South Africa Company moved its administrative headquarters there in 1907. When company-controlled territories were combined into unified Northern Rhodesia in 1911, Livingstone became the capital of a vast territory whose governance rested on appointed officials, land claims, mineral rights, taxation, and the railway lines that held it all together. Company rule ended in 1924, when Northern Rhodesia became a British protectorate under the colonial office. Livingstone remained the capital, but the BSAC kept its grip on land and mineral interests, even as the political machinery formally changed hands. The city still sat at the southern edge of a territory that was pulling economically toward its center and north. The railway had already reached the Congo border and the Katanga copper zone by 1911, and when major copper deposits were confirmed in what became known as the Copper Belt after 1928, the economic gravity of northern Rhodesia moved decisively away from the Zambezi. Lusaka offered something Livingstone could not. It sat closer to the center of the territory, better positioned along what administrators were already calling the line of rail, and better placed to oversee a copper belt economy that was becoming the actual reason Britain cared about northern Rhodesia at all. In 1935, the governor and the colonial secretariat moved. Contemporary accounts described Lusaka as a purpose-built new capital, costing around £1 million to develop, while officials quietly acknowledged the economic damage that relocation would cause to the city being left behind. Livingstone was not demolished. It survived as a town, eventually as a tourist center, a heritage site, a place where colonial architecture and the spray of Victoria Falls became part of a different kind of imperial narrative, one about discovery and grandeur rather than about company taxation and administrative convenience. But its role in the official geography of power had ended. It moved from company headquarters to protectorate capital to provincial town without anyone formally declaring that it had been erased. That is exactly how this kind of erasure works, and that is the thread connecting every city in this story. Some capitals were abandoned when the climate made them uninhabitable for the people in charge. Some were replaced when a railway changed the map. Some disappeared when a monarchy was abolished or a queen was sent into exile. Some were renamed, some were physically dismantled, and some simply faded out of the official record while the people who lived under them remembered the cost in full. The capitals that empire built were never neutral. They were instruments, and if you want to understand who held power and who paid for it, you start with the city and ask who chose the site, what it controlled, and what happened when it stopped being useful. If this kind of buried history is what you're here for, subscribing means you won't miss the next one.